Greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming for this wonderful talk with Dr. Vanessa Watts. We're eager to have her here. In tradition for the sociology department, we have a grad student who does the introduction. And so, Tori, will you go ahead and do the introduction for Dr. Watts?
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Vanessa Watts, our last speaker for this term's distinguished speaker series. Vanessa is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and the Paul R. McPherson Chair in Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Her research interests include the sociology of knowledge, indigenous ontologies, indigenous feminism, and indigenous ways of knowing. Vanessa's work has been very well received in the scholarly community. She has published in the Canadian Review of Sociology, International Journal of Child, Youth, and Family Studies, as well as Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society. Her project, entitled An Indigenous Sociology of Knowledge, Indigenous Social Lives in Indigenous Studies, Sociology, and Political Science, 1895 and beyond, is funded by SHRC to interrogate representations of Indigenous people in sociology and political science. In today's talk titled The Sociological Indian, Representations of Indigeneity in Canadian and American Sociology Journals, Vanessa will explore representations of indigeneity in thematic categories found across 5 sociology journals from the US and Canada, to understand how sociologists have either challenged state interest in indigenous issues, promoted them, and reflected indigenous social realities. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Vanessa Watts.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So, good morning, everyone. So as mentioned, I'm Anishinaabe and Mohawk. My family comes from Curve Lake, Tyendinaga, and Six Nations of the Grand River, and I live in Six Nations, which is a Haudenosaunee community about 30 minutes southwest of Hamilton, Ontario. So I want to thank the Department of Sociology for this wonderful invitation, and a special thanks to Kristen Sapatya for all her logistical support in organizing my visit. It's a real privilege to come and visit and speak with you today. And I also want to acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations for being able to come and visit today. So what I'm speaking about is part of work on data that's been collected under SHRC IDG. So I'm going to be presenting in a couple of stages. First with some background introductory remarks, followed by a high-level overview of some American-focused data, and then into a deeper dive of comparative Canadian data, which includes a closer look at some of the publications that have been collected for this study, drawing out discourses of indigeneity that have emerged in English language Canadian sociology over time. So with that, I'm going to dive right in. So as we know, many universities and colleges in Canada have in some form or fashion developed Indigenous strategies, goals, objectives to respond to the national imperative of indigenization and or decolonization, largely in a context of reconciliation, say that 5 times fast, bringing to bear questions like, what is the relationship of our intellectual practice as sociologists to the settler colonial origins of Canada itself? What place is there in our discipline for Indigenous voices, theories, and perspectives? There has been very little research done on these questions within the mainstream of the field. This work is concerned with opening up the field of sociology for broader debate through the use of theoretically informed empirical research on the sociology of sociology. So Indigenous-focused scholarship in the academy kind of writ large has produced a legacy that has been significantly influenced by the desire to capture an idea of who Indigenous peoples are. Some important theoretical propositions to grapple with are ones found in the empirical data itself that was collected for this current study, 2 of which follow here. In Langford and Ponting's 1992 work in CRS, Canadians' responses to Aboriginal issues, the roles of prejudice, perceived group conflict, and economic conservatism, they emphasize that, quote, the economic marginality of most Aboriginal people is an established fact, as are the social problems which accompany this marginality. This so-called established fact they point to is indicative of Indigenous-specific social problems, and they encourage that because of this, Aboriginal people are a good category for study on sociological terms. Further, as Graham Watson contends in his 1981 work, he writes, all Indians are in an important sense creatures of Euro-Canadian society and are to be understood primarily in terms of a massive adjustment to the Euro-Canadian administrative structure, participation in a cash and welfare economy, and the pervasive presence of Euro-Canadian technology. These assumptions about Indigenous peoples already set the terms for study in Canadian sociology, that Indigenous peoples are often economically marginalized, laden with social problems, and perhaps that an ineffectual transition to Euro-Canadian standards of society has set Indigenous peoples behind the modern-day 8-ball in substantial ways. So I do not assert these contentions should be wholly discarded. There is no better example. And of course, the Indian Act to demonstrate how racism, together with policymaking over a sustained period, produces gross inequities like sexism, violence, and economic marginality. It is crucial to both understand and interrogate these contexts. However, it is just as crucial to ascertain how diverse Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations regard themselves and our social worlds as perhaps distinctively informed outside of Euro-Canadian conceptions of the social and social problems. In a separate but connected framing over 50 years earlier, American sociologist Frank W. Blackmar, who is considered a pioneer in the development of sociology, wrote on the topic of the vanishing Indian in 1929. And he writes, some oratory has been delivered and some poetry has been written in showing the vanishing of the red men toward the setting sun. There are but hints of a great epic which has never been written and may be impossible to write. We have always had the Indian with us, and he is now here of a certainty with as many unsolved problems as ever, because when advancement is made in one line, new conditions involve the solution of new problems. So 2 comments separated by a bit of time and an imperial border, but nonetheless similar. Problems abound. For Blackmar, a clear commandment for the future of American sociology and its Indians, go forth and understand the problems of their uncivility. For Watson, a continuing failure to adapt to so-called modernity. So this work surveys Indigenous-focused journal articles in the American Sociological Review, ASR, the American Journal of Sociology, AJS, and Social Forces, SF, from seminal issues to 2019, in order to understand how Indigenous social lives are represented within the discipline. It is compared to collected data from a survey of top-tier Canadian sociology journals, Canadian Review of Sociology, CRS, and Canadian Journal of Sociology, CJS, for Indigenous-focused scholarship, where an indigeneity was central to either the title and/or abstract of the article. This Canadian-specific data was published in the CRS in 2020 and included scholarship from the creation of the journal in 1965 and 1975, respectively. So in examining the data, it is important to note, of course, that these findings do not purport to make claims about the whole of American or Canadian sociology with respect to Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous-focused books, book chapters, and other sociology journals are not surveyed. Rather, the study offers an examination of how the Indian has been shaped within top-tier journal publications and provides a space to begin perhaps a more deeper conversation about how the discipline of sociology has been motivated to make claims and draw conclusions about Indigenous peoples, as well as compare and contrast the American and Canadian sociological landscape with respect to Indigenous peoples and communities. So in this 2020 study, myself and colleagues, Drs. Greg Hook and Neil McLaughlin, we found that scholarship focused on indigeneity comprised approximately 5.1% of all articles published in the CRS, and 3.2% of articles published in the CJS. The total Indigenous-focused publications across both journals over the time period is 86. With respect to general trends, the majority of the scholarship was centered on the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, accented by issues of social movements, education, health, crime. There was little diversity across Indigenous identified groups, with the exception of anthropological and/or ethnographic research, which really dominated the Canadian Review of Sociology until the late 90s, early 2000s. Rather, by and large, Indigenous-focused scholarship was generalized as one racial category, wherein the state was central to any sort of sociological analysis of Indigenous peoples. producing a significant void with respect to diverse Indigenous-based theorizing in metrics of analysis. So in a broad context, beginning in the 18th century, a research focus on Indigenous peoples began to emerge across the academy. This focus was primarily anthropological, motivated by the desire to capture the vanishing Indian, and as Deloria states, in conjunction with Indian removal, popular American imagery began to play on earlier symbolic linkages between Indians in the past, and these images eventually produced the full-blown ideology of the vanishing Indian, which proclaimed it foreordained that less advanced societies should disappear in the presence of those more advanced. Indigenous-focused scholarship in the academy has produced a legacy that has been significantly influenced by the desire to capture an idea of who Indigenous peoples are. The vanishing Indian trope, alongside race-based settler colonial policies toward Indigenous peoples and communities, work to produce misrepresentations of Indigenous peoples by fueling the myth that Indigenous peoples needed and need so-called modern interventions for salvation. So in the Canadian-focused study, we deployed the work of Ramos, Tuck, and Glenn Coulthard in our analysis. Ramos's work and his study of representations of race and ethnicity in Canadian sociology journals found that these two categories in sociology are connected to institutionalized concepts of race and ethnicity, that the state is present in how race and ethnicity are both informed and studied in the discipline of Canadian sociology. In a similar vein, Coulthard asserts that state recognition of specially accorded rights to Indigenous peoples and communities ultimately nurtures state power over Indigenous peoples through what he terms recognition politics. And Eve Tuck's characterization of approaches to Indigenous-focused research as largely deficit-based, that is, the assumption of social problems of Indigenous peoples, was at the base of Indigenous-focused research. So I'll give kind of a high overview here of the American data. So from 1936 to 2019, the ASR published a total of 28 articles that were Indigenous-focused subject matter. The AJS published a total of 39 Indigenous-focused articles from 1895 to 2019, and Social Forces published 31 from 1922 into 2019. The height of publication rate of the relevant articles in the ASR were published during the 1940s for a total of 6, the decade following the establishment of the journal. Since the 1940s, Indigenous-focused articles began to decline in the 1950s and began to establish a steady rate in the 2000s onward of about 3 per decade. The 1940s proved to be a significant decade for all 3 journals, as the AJS and the ASR experienced a spike in relevant publications, whereas Social Forces experienced a sharp decrease of relevant publications for a total of 1. With respect to current trends, the ASR leads with relevant publications for a total of 3, though this is marginal as the AJS and Social Forces follow closely behind for a total of 2 and 1 respectively. With respect to overall population of Indigenous-focused articles over time in each journal, proportion, not population, the end value might be considered quite negligible, but this small percentage or absence speaks greatly to the underrepresentation of Indigenous-focused research in these top-tier journals. So in the ASR, it was found that Indigenous-focused article publications accounted for about 0.65% of the journal's total publications. For AJS, it was 0.91%, and for Social Forces, it was 0.74%. So across all 3 journals, Indigenous-focused literature represented less than 1% of article publications. Now, this doesn't mean that Indigenous people, American Indians, Native Americans, Alaska Natives are not mentioned in publications, but we're talking about where they are represented and mentioned in core areas of the title and abstract. The search we conducted included not just those terms, but we also ran a number of federally recognized tribes, state tribes through these data and searched for any sort of First Nation or tribe that would be present. And we found that there wasn't a lot of variation because if a specific tribe was mentioned, then it was very likely that North American Indian, Native American was also mentioned. So this represents where it's a core and central focus of the article. So when we look at the comparison of Canadian and American, and we adjusted here in the 1960s and onwards when Canadian data begins to first emerge within the journals. These comparative percentages are in sharper contrast. Both Canadian sociological journals exceed the total number of relevant publications in American sociological journals in any given decade. The height of the publication frequency occurs during the 1970s and 80s in the Canadian Review. Canadian journals have been in production for approximately half the life of their American counterparts. But for further context, the approximate current population of Indigenous peoples in Canada from the most recent census is about 4.9% of the general Canadian population, or just over double the percentage of American Indians and Alaska Natives identified in census records in the United States, which is about 2.9%. So while the American journals published a total of 98 relevant articles across the 3 journals, the Canadian sociological journals totaled 86 relevant articles over 2 journals, despite a much shorter duration, almost the half-life of their American journal counterparts. So what does this data actually look like in terms of topical areas and their relevance to the socio and geopolitical imperial forces they are nestled within? So I can talk about the methodology more in the Q&A, but I'm giving a very shortened version here so I can show you guys the interesting stuff. But what I've done here is use Sean Wilson's work, who is an Indigenous academic here in Canada, and in his work, Research and Ceremony, he divides Indigenous-focused research writ large, so not just sociology, across 5 or 6 different time periods. I'm using 5 because he also goes into the 1700s, and it's not relevant for this data. And so he labels each of these phases, the first one being the traditionalizing phase, wherein Indigenous peoples are still viewed as subhuman in some sense. And so research is justified as a form of like a civilizing practice. And then the next phase he discusses is the assimilationist research phase, and this is, for our purposes, 1940 to 1969. And this is where research transitions from physical traits and physical characteristics to the identification of social and kinship structures. And it's here that Aboriginal research becomes increasingly popular and profitable for both businesses and academics. And it's in this time period we see the emergence of what he terms Indian experts, which we can certainly see on the last slide where the 1940s was very productive on the American side of things. And then the early Aboriginal research phase, here the 1970s to the 1990s. So here he says that Aboriginal researchers begin to emerge in this research phase, but that Aboriginal focused research is still continuing on a trajectory of welfarist research, things like linguistics, religion, education, health, and other inequities. And then when we get down here to the Indigenous phase, or I'm sorry, the Indigenous phase, now we're seeing still a focus on some welfarist research, but there's more collaboration happening, more Indigenous researchers are becoming involved. So this is the stage we are currently in. So I pulled some topic areas for the first phase, which is the traditionalizing phase, and the end values are along the top here. And we look at how the research has emerged on the American side across all 3 journals. And there is a focus on things like assimilation, on things like physical and personality characteristics, studies on sex and sociality, sex and industry within certain tribes, a fascination a little bit with ceremony, so Fox Adoption Feast, the Indian Shaker ceremony, focus on Jesuit relations, and then we're still seeing this thing about physical characteristics, so when we look at mental capacity and genetics. So this one is called The Mental Capacity of Savages, and I think it was in the early 1900s in AJS, and so that's describing different mental, intellectual characteristics of savage people, American Indians, etc. This one focuses on the northwestern coast, so this area, and up into Washington as well, and the focus on how social structures included chattel slavery for American Indian tribes. So again, that sort of connection with kinship and social structures. We're starting to see on paper this same sort of progression within the research phase, where there are these physical characteristics still being talked about, but we are also moving into an interest in sort of the sociology of culture, kinship structures, food culture, etc. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about these during the Q&A. So then when we go into the assimilationist phase, according to Wilson, and I plotted some things here. Here we see a really big emphasis on things like acculturation, anxiety, the impacts of civilization on American Indian tribes. We're seeing here kind of racial categories like biraciality. So how many American Indians are intermarrying with whites is starting to come out as a more pronounced racial category. Racial hybrids, as it's termed in one of the articles in the early 1950s. So again, we're seeing acculturation, enemy in terms of not belonging to a national identity in the US, but also not feeling that they belong to their own culture because that culture is vanishing. But then we start to see these sorts of kind of welfarist issues emerge, right? Like juvenile delinquency, education, migration starts to emerge here in terms of leaving the reserve and going to an urban setting and the socioeconomic impacts of leaving one's reserve. So we definitely still see a mix here, but we are absolutely seeing this trend towards the impacts of assimilation on tribes. And then for the early Aboriginal research phase, so kind of beginning in the 1970s, research begins to really drop off here. There's not as many publications happening. There's a focus on revitalization movements here, and the Go stance in particular really showed up a lot. And this was basically one article and then several responses to this article in other forms. But absolutely things like, again, more welfarist, things about fertility, again, a focus on leaving the reserve, how will one's income be affected by leaving the reserve, the impacts of urbanization on the psyche of the Indian comes through, and then we begin to see here, towards the end, on identity. And so this is Joan Nagel's work, and it's really interesting to look at in this context of ethnic fraud and what's happening in Canada in the academy with purported Indigenous peoples. And so she's talking about this idea of what she calls ethnic switching, where individuals who previously identified themselves as non-Indian change their race to Indian on a census. And she's going into the details of that. And the reasons, which she says are one, federal Indian policy and how this is shifting the landscape, ethnic politics, and American Indian political activism, which makes a lot of sense since the data she's looking at is coming from the 1970s forward. And then we get even smaller in terms of less and less publications the closer we get to now. So in the recent Aboriginal phase, again, we're seeing more of a focus on race and a racial category becoming more prominent, taking up about half here of the publications from during this time. This one is focused on the impacts of military testing on tribal lands and creating a toxic environment, so the sociology of environment. This was sort of the first time I really see like a critique of America coming through in the publications. And then as well, Howard Ramos's work on the end on the Canadian aspects of Aboriginal mobilization and kind of fighting against the state. So we're starting to really see this sort of state criticism come through, but also race as a huge category of analysis here. So the Indigenous phase, here we're at 4 now, so I don't know what's going to happen in the next decade. This would just be an empty PowerPoint, I'm scared. But we're, again, race and race. So this one here is about genetic ancestry testing and the trend of this, and how when people don't get the results that they like, namely white people, that they're not shown to be native, they'll reject the results of the ancestry test, which is really interesting. And then this one here is on tribal sovereignty, and it was sort of an exciting read because it goes back into 30 years of different movements of tribal sovereignty within the US and social movements in the fight towards tribal sovereignty. And then this one here was written by Jeff Dennis, Laissez-faire Racism, and that's about First Nations in Northern Ontario who are dealing with racism in Thunder Bay. But race. So, as I say here, it is clear across all three journals that Indigenous peoples are treated as a racial category, and while there are clear connections to a nation-state relationship, there is a lack of focus on settler colonialism as a driver of relations. So now I want to switch here and go into the Canadian data, and I want to go a little bit closer in terms of a closer reading of some selected publications, just to show you a difference in terms of trends. So let's take a look here. This is a lot of information, but described as the phase where Indigenous researchers begin to emerge. You'll recall that Wilson contends that this phase is on a continued trajectory of welfare's research, with subject matter focusing on linguistics, religion, education, and health. So looking at the topics, it is clear there are similarities to what might be described as mediating issues of dependency, and this is what Wilson writes. 3 articles in the 1970s were oriented towards health concerns of Indigenous peoples, natality rates, blood pressure, and fertility. Read without context, one could argue that they serve to accelerate stereotypes of Indigenous peoples and that we are largely unhealthy and are disproportionately impacted by alcohol abuse. Alfred's 1970 article on blood pressure amongst the Navajo in the United States examines if and how migration from on-reserve to urban settings are a source of stress for Navajo people, as indicated by blood pressure results. Alfred ultimately concludes that leaving the reserve was a source of stress on Navajo, as demonstrated by lower blood pressure rates. Romaniuk in 1974 tests the theory that modernization may improve fertility through the, quote, relaxation of restrictive customs governing procreative behaviors of pre-modern societies, end quote, as it relates to fertility of Indians. Romania collected data from people of James Bay in northern Quebec in isolated communities and ultimately argues modernist interventions could lead to an improvement in fertility, basically saying the men are out in the bush, they're hunting too much, they're not home enough to have sex with their partners, let's put some grocery stores out there. That's kind of like what it's saying. So then we go over here. So one interesting article I really like that stood out was, it was entitled US and Canadian Indian Periodicals by John Price in 1972. So in 1972, he provides his readership with resources he cites as Indian periodicals in both Canada and the US. Price encourages the usage of these resources by other sociologists as they contain mainly political poetry and articles from the perspective of Indigenous peoples themselves, and specifically on the issue of protest. While the 1970s certainly demonstrated an emergence of critique of state control over Indigenous peoples, this dynamic is examined more substantially in the 1980s. This could be associated with the Constitution Act of 1982 and Section 35. But before examining the more politically oriented literature of the 1980s, an important intervention Raymond Breton and his co-authors make in their work research issues on Canadian cultures and ethnic groups in analysis of a conference. So Breton and his co-authors surveyed the research areas on ethnicity at a 1973 conference, noting on Indigenous peoples specifically, they say, the disintegration of the Indian community imposes on the Indians special handicaps not faced by other groups in their struggle for self-advancement and identity formation, end quote. Breton and his authors find that for Canadian sociology, policies and research focus on collective identity formation of Indigenous peoples would serve to absolve the Indian of their problems, so a sort of pan-Indian identity. Even in this relatively early emergence of Canadian sociology and Indigenous issues, it is clear that Indigenous peoples are considered a unique research group with a unique set of problems. So back to this slide, by the 1980s, Indigenous-focused research remains stable in the CRS and the CJS, experiences its first peak. While there are topics associated with particular pathologies of Indigenous people, and specifically First Nations people, things like tuberculosis, alcoholism, and reserve migration, a more socio-political focus emerges, or as Wilson might articulate, research shaped to mediate Aboriginal dependency. Research on Indigenous peoples in political leadership roles, impacts of white administrators on First Nations communities, the Donald Marshall Inquiry, and the benefits of Aboriginal nationalism point to a changing discourse of Indigenous peoples, and one that is clearly tied to the state. Further, while reserve migration and typology, indeed the reserve, is a consistent theme throughout many of the articles, almost developing into an archetype of indigeneity, land begins to be framed differently. Issues like the James Bay Cree hydroelectric dams, as well as issues of sustainable development, point to this changing research terrain beginning in the early 1990s. One in which an Indigenous-state relationship in its early stages of being a foundational dynamic and form of analysis in Canadian sociology. And this becomes even more pronounced as we move on. So many of you will know that in 1996, it was the year that RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, was released, a significant marker of Indigenous state relations. According to Wilson, while welfarist foci continue to be prevalent, the emergence of a more collaborative approach to Indigenous-focused research should be emerging in this phase here. So as noted on the slide, there remains a focus on exclusively held inequities specific to Indigenous peoples, issues like segregation, inequities in sectors such as the Juno Award, which was interesting, health disparities such as diabetes and obesity, and inequitable access to communication technology, and this was about the North and Inuit people. It is noteworthy that approximately 1/5 of the publications identified in this phase are dedicated to the issue of education. While all vary in their orientation, a common orienting theme that is threaded throughout is inequities faced by Indigenous teachers or Indigenous students. So one interesting intervention that potentially underlies the then present and contemporary production of inequities writ large was found in Vic Sachowicz's 1996 piece on the recruitment of Indian Affairs personnel during the late 19th century. So Sachowicz writes, "The racist inferiorization of Indian people and their way of life was an ideological prelude to the creation of structures and practices that were aimed at recasting Indian subjectivity and identity. The state, acting through agents of the department, attempted to create in Indian people certain kinds of citizens who would be able to accommodate themselves to agriculture, industrial capitalism, particular patterns of gender identities and relations, and certain forms of both self and political governance." So this critique of settler colonial state-making through agents of the Department of Indian Affairs is an important intervention that I read throughout the data, not just on how the conditions for inequities are made, but in how racist ideas of what Indians should be were concretized in an era of state-making. So though reserves are a common variable throughout the Indigenous-focused research, it is during this phase that urban Indigenous peoples are brought more into view. Métis sociologist Chris Anderson and his co-author Denis critique how Canadian state formation privileges a particular state-formulated Aboriginal identity with respect to Aboriginal nationalism, leaving little room for urban Indigenous peoples to make similar claims to a nation models, as they don't have a particular land base like a reserve. They emphasize that there is a need in sociology to, quote, "start thinking about urban communities as legitimate communities rather than as depositories of poverty and pathology." To further emphasize this point, Dreger in 1999 examines how urban Indigenous peoples are disadvantaged in the city, mirroring some of the conditions of the so-called reserve life that was left. Protests, the state, and Aboriginal status groups are addressed in this phase as well through Ramos's work. And he finds that there are opportunities central to how Aboriginal protest is motivated, and that's through using the state and sort of manipulating the state to achieve those end goals. So now we've arrived at our final Indigenous phase. I'm just checking my time. So from a cursory glance at the themes identified on the slide, it is evident that there is a more interdisciplinary approach to Indigenous-focused research happening. In the publication focusing on family photography, McMaster examines the methodological challenge associated with, quote, "conducting research on family photographs from persecuted communities," end quote. The piece uses family photographs from Japanese Canadians as a case study and compares them to Indigenous family photographs from the Squamish Nation. Rice and Wendell's paper on story making as a form of methodology attempts to disrupt dominant narratives by engaging with, quote, "majority and minoritized creators," end quote, in an effort to facilitate space for what they term as previously unintended experiences. Rice and Wendell invoke various Indigenous theorists and methodologists in order to reframe dominant approaches to how stories are gathered and told. Research about gender-based and race-based violence against Indigenous peoples also appear in this phase. Wharton examines Indigenous mobility, particularly in northwestern British Columbia, through the lens of discourse analysis on various billboards along the Highway of Tears. Morton argues that the billboards warning Indigenous women of the dangers of hitchhiking are both gendered and racialized. And Keepal et al. Examine the concept of social exclusion as it relates to the phenomenon of going missing. They find that Aboriginal peoples are a social group that are disadvantaged among other groups as well, and are disproportionately represented as missing persons. And I don't think it's a surprise that this is happening at this time with things like the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. So there's definitely, in my view, a strong connection to state imperatives, state agendas, etc., and what we're seeing in the research. We also see resource development as a prominent issue. Clinton recast the story of Wendigo, and Wendigo is a trickster character for Cree and Métis traditions. And he recast Wendigo as a monster within the oil industry to sort of translate how an Indigenous view or a Cree view of the oil industry might be told. And borrowing from these two communities, one might argue that Cree and Métis cosmologies and epistemologies are being centered, though it remains to be seen if this is how Cree and Métis would themselves cast Wendigo in a story of their own, or would want Wendigo represented. We see Indigenous authorship emerge again during this phase with Dene sociologist Cora Voyageur's work. She did a study on First Nations women's experience and First Nations leadership. And she opens up, kind of lets us into reserve politics to talk about the issue of sexism within First Nations communities. So while similar social problems appear in this phase from previous ones, it is clear that there is indeed more engagement with Indigenous formed ideas as analytical frames, as well as an increasingly present critique of settler colonialism. Given this, what are some of the implications that can be considered when thinking through Indigenous associated social problems? So the state and state policy focused on Indigenous peoples and communities is consistently present in the literature and ultimately provides context for how Indigenous peoples and communities will be studied, examined, etc. Overwhelmingly, the literature presents the state as an arbiter of negative social relations in Indigenous communities. As a corollary, Indigenous peoples are presented as existing in a state of injustice. The state is the most looming figure in the literature. The state, in many ways, is the primary suspect. With respect to the literature at hand, there is a constant critique of the state, its Indigenous-aimed policies, and its mishandling of Indigenous issues more generally. The most common reference to particular arms of the state are the Indian Act, Indian Affairs, the White Paper, the RCMP, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms are a few. As such, the state is presented as the shaper of indigeneity in the literature, outlining the lack of progress of Indigenous peoples, the injustices against Indigenous peoples. Métis sociologist Ron Liberté provides a crucial critique of state formation in Indigenous relations in CRS, and he writes, quote, "The state's rhetoric of transformation was phrased in terms of the now well-known Trinity formula of civilization, assimilation, and Christianization," end quote. Without such primary positioning of the state in the literature, what would the social facts of Indigenous peoples be? We don't know. It is, of course, valuable to situate and critique the state and the perverted social relations it has produced and continues to produce with Indigenous peoples. As Huang notes in 2017, quote, "Indigenous peoples, Canada's third principal minority community, exhibit the lowest political trust. The latter finding suggests that Indigenous people see federal politicians or the government as the least trustworthy of all. This sort of conclusionary finding is in some ways unsurprising, yet the state emerges continuously as a main character in the story of Indigenous peoples in the literature. As such, the cumulative history-making of Indigenous representation in the literature rather tells the story through a particular lens, Indigenous peoples as bystanders in the continued failures of the state. MacDonald contemplates a solution to this failure, that of a binational state. This sort of resituating of the protagonist, the state, as on even keel with Indigenous nations is interesting. It both recognizes the distinctive and equal nature of Indigenous nationalism while also securing state interests. While this configuration certainly boasts increased powers and authorities, it does rely on the Canadian state for the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. And it also relies on all of the many diverse Indigenous nations to be branded as one sort of superhuman Indian nation. In either form, whether reconciling national political disintegration or initiating it, the state is central in the discussion, and diverse Indigenous social configurations remain at large. A similar dynamic is expressed in Bolt's 1981 piece on the connections of Enlightenment values and Romanticism to Indigenous ideas about self-determination and internal colonies of Indigenous nations. After interviewing a number of Indigenous leaders of the time, Bolt calls for the decolonization of social institutions, a concept not commonly espoused in the literature, especially in 1981. And still, the solution to this is proposed as being properly found in the state itself. The state is proposed as capable of saving itself from itself, thus capable of ameliorating the problem of internal colonies, i.e. First Nations communities, in a just manner. And so the state continues to resound. And then here, kind of what I'm thinking about as reserves as pathological places. As mentioned, a frequently made reference, even in the literature that is not explicitly about the reserve or transition to urban centers, is reserve life. The reserve is often imagined as producing life that is hard or bad in the literature. Reserves and the management of them are a central tenet of the Indian life. Most were created during the historic treaty-making process during the mid to late 19th century in Canada. And they were designed to maintain a separation between Indigenous peoples, specifically First Nations peoples, and newly developed white settlements. The reserve system emerged as a safeguarding from white fears of Indians. The Indian Act included clauses which prevented First Nations people from selling goods off reserves, made it an arrestable offense to meet in a group of 8 or more in a pool hall. And this came about because this was during the Riel resistance in the 1880s, and there was a fear that if Indians got together, they might rise up and there would be another kind of Riel rebellion. So they amended the Indian Act to include this clause. All this affirmed by a fundamentally crucial claim: reserve land is crown land. This racist system indeed produced and is still productive of sweeping inequities and injustices. As such, this is a crucial consideration, and one that requires consideration when attempting to understand disproportionalities facing First Nations people. Nonetheless, as Tuck argues, when these disproportionate race-based inequities concretize as a presumed social fact, in this case about reserve life, this leaves little room to examine thriving, not just surviving, First Nations communities. As aforementioned, reserves and reserve life are prominent. Gerber argues in 1979 that sociologists should not typologize reserves, but consider the range of differences between First Nations communities. These differences range in degree and type of adaptation to, quote, modern conditions. Gerber describes 4 types of reserves: inert, pluralistic, integrative, and municipal. Gerber finds that the institutional completeness of a reserve will encourage the retention of respective membership by being empowered to provide infrastructure. So here a kind of push towards First Nations should have the sort of infrastructure where they can stay in their communities. In a later publication, Gerber analyzes the causes of outmigration on reserves and confirms that when employment opportunities within or near First Nation are expanded, outmigration is reduced. Fisher in 1976 revisits the notion of pathology of First Nations reserves in Canada and posits that the so-called problem of disorganization or dysfunctional acculturation should be more properly understood as a dialectic between Indians and white administrators. Fisher seeks to demonstrate that reserves are a reflex of these power relations, ultimately stifling reserves from experiencing, quote, true development. While the scholarship interrogates status, race-based policies as productive of various inequities on reserves, the reserve nonetheless functions as a space of deficiency in the literature. According to Tuck, Indigenous-focused research has this sort of legacy of damage. Over many decades, the tendency to represent reserve as pathology can contribute to the reserve as being an archetype of deficit. An example: in 1987, Fisher rejects the biological determinist notion that alcoholism is more prevalent in Indigenous communities due to racial proclivity. However, offers that, quote, although a preference for spree drinking might be an individual psychocultural trait, which is widespread among Indian groups, it seems more likely to reflect North American geography and the political economy of Indian reserves, end quote. while Fisher connects the lack of access to alcohol on reserve, because liquor licenses were banned through the Indian Act, they still are, and geography to the disproportionate tendency for spree drinking, he also affirms, quote, "There is little doubt that Indians suffer from the family disease called alcoholism," end quote. While there was significant scholarship present in the data about the challenges to state power, it is overwhelmingly clear that a univocal perspective of the reserve resounds. Further to this point on the subject of missing persons, Keepal et al. Notes, quote, "Spatial segregation occurs on Aboriginal reserves, which are characterized by high levels of poverty, persistent unemployment, crime, mental illness, suicide, and a lack of affordable housing and healthcare." And this was in 2012. They add on the topic of migration, Aboriginal people flee from their homes to escape poverty, unemployment, and other problems commonly experienced on reserves, seeking greater opportunities in the city centers, and can be reported missing by family and friends left behind. Again, it's important to know that these systemic and race-based inequities do exist and they can proliferate. However, without accounting for the ways in which Indigenous peoples do intervene, do create, do enact Indigenous forms of intervention, whether public or more discreet, the story remains incomplete, and thus the intensification of "the reserve is bad" to proliferates. So I'll conclude here. In sum, the snapshot of Canadian sociology demonstrates a strong commitment to holding the state and its social apparatus to account when it comes to unjust policies and socioeconomic realities that produce Indigenous-specific social problems. A commitment crucial to revealing and interrogating inequities produced out of unjust relationships between the state and Indigenous peoples. Further common themes also emerged across the literature. While the articulation of unjust and race-based policies are crucial to understanding social problems, it was found the state as a central figure, as the arbiter of Indigenous relations. While the state as the lead actor in Indigenous social relations with the state, the sociology of indigeneity and/or Indigenous social experiences is often expressed as a consequence of state relations in the literature, even in the form of widespread critique of the state itself, leaving one to ask, what can we know about the social as it relates to multiple, diverse Indigenous nations and communities if the state is not only omnipresent, but also if the category of Indigenous itself is mainly generalizable? It was also found that the reserve has developed over time as a taken-for-granted category of social problems. An almost problemscape, the reserve has concretized over time. While some authors argue that reserves across Canada should not all be painted with the same brush, time and time again, the reserve is painted with the same brush. Violent, deficient, and without enough opportunities. While systemic barriers do indeed exist, little can be found about to challenge these realities or supposed norms. How First Nations communities do draw upon Indigenous philosophies, axioms, and their own social institutions. And comparatively, representations of Indigenous relations within the discipline of American sociology are varied. Again, this is more high level, however. Since the late 19th century, issues related to Indigenous-centered subject areas in the discipline have largely vacillated between the ethnographic to the socio-political, wherein the American Indian is imagined as existing on this sort of precipice of vanishment. In recent years, the Indigenous-focused scholarship has surprisingly decreased, despite Indigenous-led social movements such as No DAPL and the increasing network of Indigenous sociologists across the states. Yet there has been a lack of attention across these top-tier journals paid to Indigenous theoretical interventions, and as the data demonstrated, there is a steady decrease in interest in Indigenous issues. But where the interest is maintained, there is an absence of Indigenous-informed theories and ideas, and that Indigenous peoples are mainly simply a racial category to be studied. This characterization obfuscates any real engagement with settler colonialism as a driver of relations. And so, can other forms of Indigenous-based social realities, theories, and methodologies find a more significant place in sociology going forward, beyond a lens informed by already established rules of theoretical, statistical, and methodological engagement? In more recent scholarship in both the CJS and CRS, authors called for the integration of Indigenous theorizing in terms of analyzing social realities and social problems, which is a great thing. But aside from integration, what are the possibilities for Indigenous ideas and understandings of the social to be engaged with beyond a lens, but as the arbiter of social relations outside of state-informed parameters of indigeneity? This would properly broaden the scope of Indigenous social worlds, their vastness, distinctiveness, and complexities, and thus contribute to a deeper understanding of what the social is for diverse Indigenous communities beyond problem-oriented framings. So thank you. Nyawa.
Thank you, Dr. Watt. So we'll open it up for questions for about the next 15 minutes.
Yes, hello.
Hello, thanks so much for this. It's a really interesting talk.
Thanks.
I had a question, I guess, about whether or not you were able to look at citation patterns. And here I'm thinking in particular, like, the whole argument of society about Orientalism
Sure.
is so self-referential. Did you see anything like that as well?
So we have discussed that would be the next phase of this, was the sort of citational practice. By and large, we don't see any sort of Indigenous sociologists being cited until the early 1990s. And then where they are, it's kind of the same one and the same thing, and there's not really anything outside of that. But no, we haven't looked at like what are the sort of theoretical norms that are drawn on consistently within the literature, but we've absolutely talked about that for sure. I think it'll be really compelling to see, actually. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Hi.
Great, thank you. There's a lot to think about here.
Yeah.
And I have two questions. One is kind of similar to the question about citations. And I'm not sure how you would ever study this, but I was thinking a little bit about the networks of reviewers and things.
Yeah,
like,
rejections
it's really
too.
interesting to think about the mechanisms through which something gets published, which of course it starts with someone deciding to even send it out to reviewers. And the tiny proportion of Indigenous scholarship in American journals makes you think that it's probably hard to find reviewers.
Right.
So that there could be these like very frequent barriers, like if you ask 7 people and nobody says yes, then you're like, well, I'm not gonna review that paper.
I think that's right, and I think there's also, Indigenous sociologists, American Indian, Native American, who don't want to publish in these 3 journals because one, maybe the legacy that they do have, or there's a more interdisciplinary journal that would be a much better fit for that work.
Get a better reviewer.
Or get a more suited reviewer, but we also thought about it would be interesting to kind of look at rejection patterns as well, although I don't think we would have access to that information. But certainly in that vein of like, what is the structure in terms of publishing? Why is there so few? Is there really a decreasing interest, or are people being rejected? My sense is that people are less interested because there was such an interest in studying these traits of Indians and savages. And then when that shifted in a sort of post-war era, and it was just kind of like, okay, assimilation is the game in the US, and removing people, it's like all of that is happening, Indian boarding schools, there was already this trend towards assimilation. So then it became this racial category thing, and how are they, and because it's so much less about nation state politics. In Canada, this is like resounding. In the US, it's really about this sort of category, right? So I think the US journals are really primed to have this sort of conversation, actually, but I don't know how well it will go. But I think they're primed. I think it's like, let's go. Yes.
Because I feel like you started to answer my next question, which is, I found myself wondering if there's something about the power of how race has been conceptualized in the US that has not opened it up to thinking about settler colonialism, because it's so oriented towards a black-white dynamic, which really isn't, it's oriented around slavery, certainly colonialism, but not the displacement of people from their lands. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I think you started to suggest.
Well, and I think a real connection there is this kind of insistence on the vanishing Indian, right? As that they really only sort of appear as like a lost civilization. Like the appearance of them is an absence, which is interesting, or the appearance of them is a sort of racial hybrid, or the appearance of them is white people who don't get the result they want on ancestry DNA, or the appearance of them is they intermarried. But it's always about whiteness, actually. It's always about whiteness in all of these, except in the early 20th century when it was never about whiteness. It was about what is the Indian Shaker ceremony like? What is the Fox adoption feast like? So that is really interesting too to think about, that it sort of hinges on whiteness. and in Canada it hinges on the state, a more political orientation, but it can't exist without this other thing, right? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the Canadian journals from 2010, there's more interdisciplinary approaches. And I'm wondering if you found traces of that in the earlier, even from the 70s or in the United States in the 1890s, because particularly there's a lot in anthropology, a lot in ethnology, and I'm sure there's some borrowing from sociology from these fields.
You're right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of anthropology. There was demography, thinking about population differentials, etc. So, and some kind of historians would sometimes come in, but mainly it was anthropology was the biggest one in both the CRS and in AJS. They were the big ones. And then demography was kind of like that next tier, very low compared to anthropology, but that was the next time when you'd see co-authorships. You'd often see sociologists and demographers together. And in the 2020 publication, we do look at author affiliations for the Canadian data. I have the US ones too, but it's just too much and the table's like insane. It would be horrible looking at it right now. But yeah, we look at author affiliations, and we also look at research interests of the author. And what we overwhelmingly find is most of the authors don't study Indigenous anything actually, but they've come across a data set and they publish on it. And that's it. And some of them do, but a lot of them do not, actually.
Just quickly, you did then include sociologists, right? Or anthropologists in the CRSA.
We did in terms of the data, but in terms of like the close reading, those have been removed and they really do start to fall off in the 1980s and it becomes more sociology. There's still anthropology, and then in the 2000s again, that's it, right, when it switches to just CRS. Yes, yeah, but they are included. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm going to ask another follow-up question too, and it's about that sort of fundamental tension between these journals that position themselves as kind of canonical, and these questions of generalizability, which I think is a fundamental challenge for like them. Is that the heart of it then, this sort of notion that the canonical journals need to sort of establish a generalizability that maybe other journals don't necessarily feel?
A generalizability about what? About Indigenous peoples or about theories? I'm not sure.
About any lessons that they want to provide and say, this is why we're canonical, because we're generalized.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, but see, here, like when I think about, okay, challenging the sort of canon or the rules and the metrics, like we found within the Canadian data that even the terminology going from Indian to Native to Aboriginal to Indigenous was all about Indian affairs. And when Indian affairs changed its name, in sociology, that term would come up to this sort of new generalizable term, but really it's following actual state practices. It's not necessarily, the canon in this case is the state. Like that's what is influencing the sort of Indigenous sociology in Canada is Canada, right? And that it's not theory necessarily, or it's this idea of like the state relations, right? And then certainly theories around like group conflict, etc., especially the sociology of education that keeps coming through. But it really is, in my view, this idea of the state as being so involved, whereas in the States, it's really about race and ethnicity as being the sort of driver and generalizing categories of American Indian, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, etc. Yeah. Yep, and then yep.
I just have a half-baked comment, but I was
okay.
Thinking about this a little bit, and I was thinking it might be interesting to do kind of an analysis similar to this on introductory sociology textbooks.
Right. So this has been done. This has been done, and this is, and now I'm forgetting the name because it's in the IDG application that we use that in the lit review, and this was done. Although I think it's a bit dated, I think it's like 10 years old. It looks and compares any appearance of Indigenous or Aboriginal anything in every introductory textbook in Canada from a certain time period, and it analyzes that, and it's really, really interesting. So that work has been done, but as a follow-up, kind of post-TRC, I think it would be interesting to even get a smaller snapshot of that for sure. But I can get you the name. It's somewhere in my hard drive somewhere. It's very good. Very good. It's a book. Yep. Yes.
Yeah, this was really, it just got my mind racing of all the things you could possibly do in addition. So this is one of those sheepish questions that are like, here's 20 things that I can imagine doing with this stuff. But
sure.
What I'm really curious about is like a comparison to some other, another comparison. Like, is there a similar Canadian-U.S. divide in discussions of Asian American, Asian North Americans, or other races? Like, is this really distinct, or is this a similar divide or a similar difference? Is it always focused on the state in Canada versus these racial classifications across other racial groups, across other like ethnicities? What's just thinking about like the exciting potential of just really seeing if this is like a common pattern or but just like what's going on in the larger landscape of sociology, or not even like ethnic studies or racial studies, but like the larger sociological landscape. Is the U.S. one focused more on like classification of individuals, and Canada focused more on the state? I'm just wondering like where this fits into this larger landscape.
So that's a great comment, and Ramos talks about race and ethnicity in Canadian journals as tied to institutionalized kind of powers and funding in terms of how they're talked about within Canadian sociology. I would say that in the States, it's probably less, I'm not gonna make a comment because I don't know, but what I know in terms of the difference is the treaty relationship, right? That both in the US and in Canada, Native people have treaty relationships with the states that other groups do not have. And yet in the US, that is the thing that is not talked about at all, ever, except maybe like once or twice it might be brought up, right? But it is so negligible, it's not even worth talking about, right? And in Canada, it is talked about, but it's still about the state, and not even Indigenous interpretations of that treaty and what might be a form of justice or how Indigenous peoples enact their responsibilities to the treaties, right? So still this conversation is not good enough. Within these discussions within the state is totally absent. It's just totally absent, and it is all about census, race. It was more interesting in some ways to read the 1920 stuff, which was more racist actually, but you were like hearing from Native people in the publications because they were sort of like fetishizing Native people, which is terrible, but there was more of a presence. But in more recent ones, it's really about whiteness actually, and comparisons to whiteness, and that's it.
And then another comparison I was thinking of is like the journals that Indigenous scholars do submit to. They think their scholarship is more of a fit, like comparison there. What are they talking about? What are things there? Like, Like, can we?
So that's part of the grant. There are 3 Native American journals, and on the Canadian side as well, where we pull discourses out of those journals and say, do these line up with either poli-sci or sociology? And land is something that the Canadian sociology journals talk about, but they talk about it in terms of resource extraction and how to have better relationships with Indians so that you can get those through, right? Whereas in the journals, the Native American journals, they're like, resource extractions and like F the state. And this is like it's a totally different orientation. Other than that, there's a lot more distinctiveness in the Native American journals in terms of like this community in particular, this sort of linguistic tradition in this community. This is the ontoepistemologies of this community. That is like totally absent in sociology.
Does that go back to the 1950s, 60s?
No, it goes back for the American Indian Quarterly, I think it's the 1970s, and then it doesn't really pick up again until the late 90s, early 2000s with other journals. So it'd have to be adjusted again for the 70s, and that's only the American Indian Quarterly, so to compare that one-to-one to Canada will be something, but there are Indigenous people from Canada in the American Indian Quarterly. Yes, and then,
Thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you.
I was really curious to learn about how you're thinking the relationship between sociology and history in this historical review. And I was wondering if perhaps there is an incommensurability in the fact that sociology
walks or distance itself from history, and then the possibility of engaging further with an indigenous perspective on, so incorporating indigenous theories and indigenous methodologies because of this stepping perhaps or creating historical sociology as a specialty within sociology, but no longer a perspective. So I wonder if perhaps a more historical take on sociological analysis would perhaps make, I know this is a bit general, but I don't think, the ways in which the discipline shifts and potential points of entry into incorporating perspective. And also, this would be a second question, like what are for you like potential points of entry of indigenous theories and methodologies into sociology?
Well, one is doing the sociology of sociology, where, as someone who was the only Native person in her PhD program who had a very difficult time when Indigenous peoples were talked about in the classroom, this is also like a way in which to sort of talk back on sociological terms. I've had the question before, well, should there be an Indigenous sociology? I don't know how I feel about that, so I don't have an answer other than what I know for sure is Indigenous ideas or ways of knowing, which I don't necessarily know what that means, but that we have social theories. So social theory is social theory, and we have social theories, and they should be able to be debated and included and talked about. It's when it's connected to things like sacred knowledge, which is also written about in the 1920s and 30s. So if we start bringing in sacred knowledge, then we, as Indigenous academics, have to be very careful about what we're theorizing about, where it's coming from, if it's allowed to be debated, if it's considered pure knowledge. So I think that, which I have a big problem with, so I think we're at this point right now where there's, Indigenous studies, which is making these huge gains in the academy, which is very exciting. And I'm in Indigenous studies at Mac as well. And then there's this idea that disciplines want to bring in Indigenous knowledge and sort of try to put it's like pepper on mashed potatoes. Is it like seasoning? Is it like real? Is it the mashed potato? I don't know. But I think there needs to be time for us to figure that out about what is sacred knowledge, what is an idea, can they be separated, who gets to represent what knowledge. My fear is that we'll come to a place where only, Haudenosaunee people can theorize about this and nobody can critique that, right? And then we're gonna become so distinctive from each other that's my worry. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think I've seen a little bit of this. And then in these other disciplines, mainly social sciences, where it's kind of like, let's throw a native on a grant and let's get indigenization going, right? So there's these two sort of problems happening here. So I don't necessarily know how to answer that question in terms of the historical analysis piece, but I do think in terms of examining sociology as a discipline, we're at a place right now where a lot of this conversation is happening is because of reconciliation as a national imperative, not because sociology decided to have a conversation with Native people instead of just write about them, but because of reconciliation, right? And so that doesn't really feel that great either. In terms of being Indigenous and in sociology, it probably feels a little unsettling. Pun, settler, I don't know. But anyway, okay, yes, and then.
Yeah, follow up on your answer. What are the main themes that Indigenous scholar sort of critique to other sociologists and sociologists talking about the main themes that you found in the research? That would be one question. And the quick one, another one, will be an Indigenous sociology of the state.
An Indigenous sociology of the state.
Yeah.
I don't know if I understand the question. I'm sorry, can you talk about it a bit more?
Because you talk about how...
Oh, an Indigenous sociology of the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, well, it would be that sort of section that I talked about, but
yeah.
I mean, much more in depth. I think that part is really exciting, actually, and I think what you would find is bringing in, people like Coulthard and Tuck and Sarah Hunt and Zoe Todd and other people working on data sovereignty like Desi Lonebear, I hope I have their name right. Sorry?
Rodriguez Lonebear.
Thank you. Who writes about data sovereignty as tied to imperialism and bringing in those sorts of theories and analyzing like the different discourses that come out of sociology, which seems to be just so like very much in a relationship with the state, right? And that is number one, to see how it shifts from an interest in Native people to talking about the state constantly, even when going like this to the state. It's like you can't stop talking about the state ever. So I don't know what would happen if we were to say, okay, sociology, let's focus on this community and what happened here and their thriving and what they've done in these discrete mechanisms and this. I don't know that that's going to be good enough for sociology. I think it should be, but I don't know if it is. Yeah, I don't know. And I missed the first question.
What were the main themes that you found when the mission scholar criticized social scientists talking about it?
I mean, the main themes, like, for this study, there was really like 2 or 3 Indigenous sociologists, and then my work, but it's not captured in the data because it's out past 2019. But the main sorts of things were people like Anderson, who says that sociology is so obsessed with like First Nations only, not talking about Métis, and not talking about urban people, and only talking about the reserve. And sort of this sort of like, we have a political identity too, that's different. Cora Voyager, who's kind of also talking about the reserve, but to me was very brave and saying, I'm going to show you how First Nations communities can sometimes be sexist. And it's because of Bill C-31 and the 1985 Amendment to the Indian Act. And this is what our women leaders have to deal with. It's not just about white people. And I thought it was really brave to sort of pull back the curtain a bit and say, this is what's going on here, right? So the critique, it would definitely be something around too much focus on damage, too much focus on inequities, and like we know these things, but let's like start thinking of solutions from Indigenous peoples. And then I think another critique would be too much generalizing of an identity. Indigenous, like I've read articles in the CRS where they're like Indigenous people on reserve. I'm like, no, First Nations people on reserve. Métis and Inuit don't live on reserves. First Nations people do. So it's just sort of like this kind of taken for granted sort of generalizing theme about Indigenous with no nuance happening. Yeah.
Last question.
Pressure.
Don't make it too hard, okay? Because I've been talking for like over an hour.
I think I'll go back to my original one.
Okay.
I'm thinking, honestly, how have non-Indigenous scholars started to frame their articles and analysis with the emergence of Indigenous workers? The language games that I'm now happy to replay.
Yeah.
Whereas through those different phases, and you see that in the most recent phase, when do those language games make you feel it's a game continuing?
Right, that's what a great question. Okay, so the first one, what I see mostly is settler colonialism, whiteness, as a new form of critique of the state. It's important, but it's not like an Indigenous so-and-so and so. It's like settler colonialism. So again, it's like recentering whiteness and recentering the state in the form of a new critique of the state. So it's still not pulling necessarily on Indigenous ideas or methodologies. And when do I feel like it's a game? When I see things like a sudden interest in residential schools in 2009 emerge in the literature with no one ever writing about this before. When there's a sudden interest in missing and murdered Indigenous women, when nobody's written about this before that author, but the National Inquiry is happening and there's an opportunity to kind of be an expert. Those sorts of things, although we have a kind of increase in Indigenous interests, right, that's been adjusted for now anthropology being reviewed, it's still quite steady in these journals, but they are even more closely mirroring state agendas about indigeneity, right? And so that to me gets kind of frustrating sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Watt.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know it's the end of term, it's like the worst So thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Catherine Corrigal-Brown, the head of sociology at UBC. Thanks for watching our video. To learn more about UBC sociology, please subscribe.